Hello everyone in person and everyone online. We've got our RSE seminar. So this week we've got Heather Turner from Warwick, who is very involved with the R project, which is R coding, statistics and other things. So we've done quite a few languages this term so far. And she's going to talk to us a bit about R, but also about kind of the EDI side of RSE and some of the work he's been doing with organising the R project. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so I realised, we're kind of a diverse group, so I thought I'd just start with a little background about R, just to get us all on the same page. I guess most of you will have heard about R and have an idea about what it is. It's a programming language that particularly focuses on statistical computing, and that's sort of got broader as time has gone on. So the broader range of under the umbrella of data science. It was originally developed by academics teaching in statistics, but now it's much more widely used across sectors and domains. It has perhaps a little bit of a reputation for being, maybe not a serious language that's perhaps just used for prototyping, but I don't think that's true anymore. It's used in what we might call production applications, critical things like COVID modelling, or other sort of business analytics, or within the pharma industry, other sort of applications at the coalface. But still, of course, it does have that sort of use in as a prototyping language, as something that might get turned into something else, or as perhaps the first language that a new method might be implemented in, particularly if it's on the statistics side. And in terms of the structure, there's a core code base, which is actually a lot of C code, a little bit of Fortran, a bit of R. And this sort of core code base underpins then a wide ecosystem of packages. There's an official package archive called CRAN or CRAN, and that has about 20,000 packages. And then there are other official packages, notably the bioconductor repository, which focuses on bioinformatics, and some other ones, and beyond that, GitHub packages, internal proprietary packages, and so on. So to go a little bit more about the history in terms of the actual development of R. So as I say, it was developed by academics. You may know their names, Robert Gentleman and Rossi Harker. Both based in New Zealand at the time, as I say, in statistics. And so they were developing it based on earlier work in X and S+, using it for teaching. And then after that, so that was about 30 years ago, started sharing it informally with other academics who would use it in their teaching and contribute back. And after a few years, they were persuaded to release it under a GPL license. And a couple of more years after that, they established the core team. So these became the people that were responsible for maintaining the core code base. If it was version controlled in version from the start, but these days they're the people who have the commit rights to the version repository where the code lives. And there's also this sort of core code base that defines the actual R language and so on, and a set of packages which has grown up over time as well. It's now 14 base packages, which is what you would get if you installed the base distribution of R. And they provide the basic mathematical, statistical tools, base graphics, interfaces so that you can import different types of data files, the real nuts and bolts of R. So thinking about the sustainability in EDIs, as Jack said, that's what I want to talk about today. Here I've got a graph that shows all the members that have been part of the core team since the start. So you may remember from my last slide, there were 8 members initially, and people have come and gone over time. So sort of, I think it's a very interesting graph. There's sort of lots you can pick out. And one of the sort of first things you see is there's a big range in the number of commits a core member might make. They might be even in the single digits or tens. And then you get someone like Brian Ripley, who joined the core team after a couple of years and was the most prolific person, at least in terms of number of commits, which isn't a perfect measure, but certainly order of magnitude more than others. Even other heavy committers like Martin Meckler, he was the third person that joined Robert and Ross at the beginning, so he's been there the whole time. So Brian officially retired about here. He's still very active in his emeritus position. We have other key people like Robert Gentleman is very active, but he has done things but hasn't been committing to the core code base for over 10 years. And so you do see a sort of picture of there was a lot of very sort of a wide active group sort of in the early part of this century, and in the sort of last 10-15 years it's dropped off a bit. There have been new people come in, like Michael Lawrence is one of the people on the he's been involved in the bioconductor project. The two most recent members of our core, Tomasz Kanabira and Sebastian Mayer, have come in and become very active. But still, there's a difficulty because, of course, this is quite a long period of time, back since 1997. So as I've indicated, some have already retired, some are getting certainly near the end of their careers. So there's that side of it, as well as people already having effectively left, even if they're officially part of the core team. And sort of with a background of R becoming more popular, used in a much larger user community and many more practices depending on this core code base. So that's a ability issue. And then on the EDI side, we don't have so much data. I mean, certainly if you sort of run your eye down those names, if you can see at least in the room, it's very male dominated, the core team. You can also say with a little bit of background knowledge or quick internet research, that these are mainly white folks from USA, Europe, and New Zealand. So it's not diversity in that sense either. They are supported by a wider community of contributors, and I don't have pretty good data on that, but we're talking, in terms of sort of active people in dialogue with our core, sort of contributing to the bug tracker and so on. It's fairly small numbers, maybe sort of 50 regular people sort of contributing by commenting or using bugs and so on, sort of outside of that. So it's fairly sort of small external contributor community, and you can sort of get a little idea of what the diversity might be in that group by looking at the next ring round, which would be the maintainers of R packages on the biggest repository that I mentioned earlier. So this data is a little bit old, about 5 years, but nevertheless, we sort of see the same trends the same issues that I was talking about. You see the core team, very male dominated, focused on the global north, where people are based. So it's not so diverse, and this doesn't really reflect the user community. So why should we worry about diversity? And there's lots of arguments you put forward, and I think one is that ideally the people that are involved in the developer side would be representative of the user community. So there's a general issue in tech about lack of diversity and so on, but the R community itself is much more diverse than sort of. If we're interested in improving sustainability, it makes sense to sort of try and bring in the widest group, So we've got more people we can potentially involve, and hopefully, together that increases the innovation and reduces duplication of efforts, and also, makes it seem a more welcoming community. So a problem with a sort of less diverse community is that if you don't feel like you fit, then you're less motivated perhaps to get involved. So that's something we want to avoid. So we're interested in sort of tackling these issues together as much as we can. So a working group was set up a few years ago because people were aware of this issue in the R community. And there were already sort of community groups like Ladies, for example, that were trying to improve the situation in the community at large, but there hadn't been such a focus on the developer community, the people that were contributing to base R. So this working group was set up and started to sort of attack it from a few angles, engaging with people on social media, working on some documentation, trying to organising some paid projects to work on things, and organising some events as contributors. That's a very brief overview. I'm going to go into a lot more detail about what we've done over time. And throughout all these sort of activities, trying to keep their focus on engaging with people so that they're not left out. So I'm going to talk about this work in sort of 3 phases, which sort of more or less go 3 years since that group was set up. So one of our first things was to set up a Slack group. So before this, the only ways of interacting with our core were through the bug tracker, and they use Bugzilla, which means that every time anybody comments, the whole core team gets emailed. So they don't like people to chit chat on the bug tracker. It has to be very focused. And there was also a mailing list, and again, that they're receiving a lot of email. It's not a very social space. So the Slack was set up, to be a little bit more of a friendly place, somewhere that would be more supportive of people that were new. So we were sort of targeting 3 types of people: the people wanting to get involved, hopefully some experienced members, contributors and members of our core who were willing to work with new people and be a little bit more tolerant and patient, and also community organisers, from the different groups in the wider R community who just wanted to sort of connect to this initiative. Another early project was funded by the R Foundation, which is the not-for-profit that supports the R project. And they funded someone from the working group, Sanjeet Kaur-Bergal, to develop some documentation. So this was another issue. There's a lot of documentation, but it's very technical, it's quite spread out, and it's all very well telling people to go and read documentation, but if it's tens of pages long, obviously we're not going to do that just when to report bug or whatever. So we tried to produce this sort of friendlier documentation that was a bit easier to navigate, and also a little bit more sort of recognizing where people are. So a lot of users are actually on Windows, whereas a lot of the core team are using Linux. And again, it's no good telling somebody who's just showing an interest, or you've got to swap operating systems and learn to build R on Linux and so on. So we made sure people knew how they could get a copy of R Devel on Windows just with the binary. And we focused on the bug tracking process and review, which is one thing that our core had specifically asked help with through a post on the blog, the R development blog. So it wasn't covering everything, but we were focused on the 12-week project, and those were the things that we thought would be good to focus on to start with. And then this is sort of coming up to a year after the group was developed. We organised a couple of tutorials at the Use R conference, which is the sort of main R conference that is supported by the R Foundation. It's the most likely place you're going to meet a member of our core. a good group of those would tend to go to the conference, although to be fair, this is when the conference is online in 2021. But nevertheless, in each of these cases, we had a member of our core, so Martin Becker or Michael Burns, together with a member of our contribution working group, Gabe Becker and Mike Chirico, joining together to give tutorials about either contributing to R or translating R to language, which is focusing on translating the errors, warnings and messages in R to other languages. So if I share the slides later, you'll be able to follow the links for more detail of those. So at this stage, I got my RSE Fellowship, I began my RSE Fellowship sort of July 2021. My sort of proposal was sort of centered on this idea of improving sustainability and EDI in the R project, and it sort of bundled together quite a bit. So I'm based at Warwick University, so there were some parts, a component where I was planning to contribute to helping people with R and data science within the university, and continuing to sort of maintain my packages and develop my own packages. But then these other aspects of contributing to the R project, not just through code, but through building up the sort of infrastructure and working on outreach to help help with this sort of sustainability and diversity issue, and broader sort of community building, both in the R and RSE communities, with this focus on EDI. So that was the sort of scope of my fellowship, which enabled a sort of gearing up. So this is a sort of gearing up phase. So one aspect with this was sort of professionalizing a little bit the working group. We were able to get an official subdomain on the R project's website for a contributor site, so that there was an obvious place where people could go to find out about Slack, find the documentation, the links to the use R tutorials and an event calendar, and also started building up a presence on Twitter, which at the time was one of the most active places for our folk, not quite these days. Working again with Saranjit, who, if you remember, was the person that did the initial project on the R Dev Guide. We got a little bit of funding from Code for Science and Society to organise some events to try and build ability, connect people to the documentation and Slack, and just to build things up a little bit. So the idea was we organised 4 sessions introducing ways to contribute, and it was really targeted at people that were just curious, So it wasn't so much a tutorial, it was quite informal interactive sessions. These are online, so that we could again target people from wherever around the world, and people from underrepresented groups to get involved without sort of feeling worried about background knowledge or whatever, because we weren't assuming any of that. So again, we were focusing on the key topics, so bug handling, exploring Bugzilla, doing some exploratory analysis together to sort of see what the state of bugs were, and to have a little bit of practice at reviewing bug reports and thinking about how you can triage bugs for either yourself to then contribute to, or to help our core and others know what to focus on, highlighting bugs that can be closed, for example, and save people a bit of time. And then also the localization or translation that I was mentioning before. So again, we were just exploring the status of things. So this is not quite how it was at the time. Actually, this was a slightly updated one, but the picture wasn't so much different at the time. So that there are some languages that are very well maintained, like French and Italian. And others, what's happened is they've been quite well translated at one point, and then they've what's happened with these sort of lighter purple is that the English message has been updated, and the it hasn't been updated in the other language, so it might not make sense at all, or it might just be a little bit fuzzy. And then you've got some languages that aren't so well covered, and one surprise here was Spanish, not being so well translated, you know, given that it's a widely used language, and one that would be quite, you know, nice to have good coverage. We also sort of introduced the translation infrastructure, which is sort of traditional PO and POT files, if you're sort of familiar with that, to sort of explain how that works, and sort of co-wrote a post for the R blog about the status of translations. And then again, we organised an event around Use R, still online in 2022. So it was fairly ambitious. We were trying to organise a sort of global event that went over 24 hours. It was actually in 3 4-hour sessions to work on open bugs. We didn't get a huge number of people. It was about 20 people, but it was quite a good range of people that were new to working on our bugs, and experienced people, including our core. And we made quite an effort to sort of pull out bugs that were good for beginners. I mean, it's quite a challenge because, you know, if someone's going to get to grips with something in 4 hours, it needs to be fairly simple. So even out of these 22 bugs, you know, when we looked at them a bit more closely, some of them weren't actually so suitable for new people. But nevertheless, we managed to look at quite a few of them. So about half ended up being fixed sort of during the Bug BBQ or soon after, you know, because of the result of the discussions and the work that was done. So, you know, we're fairly happy with that as an experiment. It's sort of for what we found was for new people, it was more of a learning experience, you know, because they could pair up with more experienced people and talk about bugs together. And for experienced people, it was just a sort of prompt to act, you know, so a dedicated time to work on contributing to R. And then at this point, Ella joined me working on fellowship, so she works with me just quarter time, and manages to squeeze quite a bit into that time. She's taking a particular focus on providing our training at Warwick. She supports me in community outreach, particularly in organising the Rainbow R community, which is an online community for LGBTQ+ folks. And then she engages in general with what I'm doing, and yeah, so some of the things I haven't mentioned yet, but yeah, so basically her joining me gave a little bit more capacity for bigger challenges, sort of going into the 3rd year of the working group. And the other significant thing about this 3rd year is that we knew we were sort of heading for a big event that was supported by my fellowship, which was a developer sprint. So this last phase is sort of heading up to the sprint. So this is when we started doing some summer code projects. So this isn't one that Ella and I worked on directly. So this is work by others in the working group. So Mike Chirico, I mentioned before, gave one of those tutorials in Use R 2021. He worked with Ben Uber, who's done a lot of work on dashboards, and they supervised a project creating a dashboard to track translation status. So we thought after doing that sort of collaborations campfire, that it would be nice, you know, to be able to sort of monitor this in real time. We didn't quite get that far through this particular Google Summer of Code project, because unfortunately the student didn't complete the program, so they only got so far, but they did sort of produce a prototype dashboard for monitoring and tracking translations. Another exciting thing that happened in that summer was Roxy set up a prototype instance using WebLate, which is a general platform for translating translation in general. So it can be even working on bigger things than sort of messages in a software program, but it is used by various software projects, for this purpose of translating and localizing their messages. And the big advantage is that it means that people can just sign up through the web platform, and they're sort of guided through the messages that need translating, and they don't need to understand the underlying format of the files. They don't need to create a patch or anything. They just need to focus on the translations. So he set up an instance and presented this at EPSRC 2022. And sort of going on from that, people started testing it out and working together to sort of improve the setup of it, so that and getting familiar with how it works. And then a few folk organised a translation hackathon at the Latin R conference, still online, so everything's still online in 2022. So the Latin R conference is, as the name suggests, an R conference in Latin America. So they were focusing on Brazilian, Portuguese, and Spanish. It's a trilingual conference, English being third. And so this was a satellite event, and they managed to get 10 people along, and it was only a couple of hours, I think, but they managed to work through quite a lot of messages in that time, even though a lot of people were new. So this really showed the potential of that WebLate platform for an effective platform for people to leave contribution. And people continued to work during sort of beyond, sort of outside events. And there was the first patch which bundled a lot of the contributions from WebLate to BaseR. So this was sort of beginning of this year, 2023. So these changes would then be in the latest version of R4.3. And you can see the credits of people. So you have some people that are really beavering away and doing over 1,000 just by themselves. And you have others that are just sort of doing 10 or 20, even a couple. It all sort of gets brought in together to improve the coverage in BaseR. So this is a while now since we first worked on the R dev guide, or Saranjeet did most of the work on the dev guide, and there'd been some content, some continued work just on a voluntary basis, but there was lots more we wanted to do based on feedback from people that had used it, and people that wanted to do different things that the dev guide didn't cover. So we were able to get funding from the Google season of docs for Saranjeet to continue working, and she was joined by a second technical writer, Luis Revilla Sancho, and they were doing quite a range of work, sort of improving the content that they added on a voluntary basis, sort of tidying up some of the things that Saranjeet wasn't able to do in the first project, but also adding new material. So they added a chapter on translations, not yet WebLate, because WebLate was still sort of seen as experimental at that point, but sort of building out the instructions. So now we did include building from source based on Linux and Windows, and also a sort of less official way of testing patches. So as I mentioned, R is version control use some version, but there is a community run GitHub mirror of the repository. And so that can be quite useful to create the PR in order to run the tests before you submit it on Bugzilla for our core to look at. So we documented that workflow, which again is quite useful if people aren't able to build and source on their own machine. You know, they can just test something out through the GitHub mirror. Then we started running contribution office hours, which we still run. So this has sort of been going for about a year. Every month we hold two sessions at different times so that hopefully people can make one or the other. And so this is just a way, you know, for people to find out more about contributing to R if they're new, or to get a bit of help or feedback, you know, if they're trying to do something, because you know, it can be quite difficult sort of outside of the organised events to make progress. And you know, you might try putting a message on the bug tracker that maybe our core don't have time to look at it for months, you know, and so things can drag on for a while. So it's quite useful to have something regular that people can check into. And then we start looking ahead to this sprint that I mentioned before. So the idea was to bring together both novice and experienced contributors to work with the R core team and to work on contributions to base R. And we held it a couple of months ago at Warwick, a 3-day event. And people had the opportunity to self-nominate for a place at the sprints. So here's a sort of overview of who ended up coming. So we tried to get as many R core members involved as we could, so we were able to get 11, which is pretty good going. And we invited people, so that includes people like me. I count as an invited person because I'm organising it, but also other members of the R contribution working group and some other experienced contributors. And then we selected another 30 people from around 80 nominations and tried to get a sort of balance of experience and also a good representation. So obviously this doesn't cover all sort of different demographics. You can see we managed to get quite reasonable representation, you know, given that a lot of our core members and invited people would be from the UK or USA. Managed to get people from quite a wide number of countries and sort of outside of core, more than half sort of self-identified as coming from one or more underrepresented group. And in terms of the skills, you know, this sort of distribution is really what we were aiming for. You know, we wanted people to be able to come, but obviously we wanted there to be enough experienced people that, you know, they could work together and do something useful. So that sort of worked quite well. And we were also interested in the sort of potential translators. So either they sort of explicitly said they were interested in translation and they had language skills, or we could detect that they probably did based on, you know, where they lived, but perhaps they wouldn't be interested, or you know, they had other skills that might be better used elsewhere. Or we didn't know because we didn't actually put it as an explicit question on the form. So this was a little bit fuzzy and maybe could be improved in future. Yeah, so given that we had that sort of spread in skill and we wanted to be able to do something useful at the sprint, there was quite a lot of preparation in the run-up. So we made an effort to sort of point people to all the existing resources. Some people will have already been to the Use R tutorial or Collaboration Campfire or something, and not everybody, and so we made sure people were aware of all the resources we had already. One of the participants, Shannon Pelleggi, happened to want to run a workshop on debugging in R, and so that happened to time in quite well, and so we could point people to that if they weren't very confident in their skills about just sort of debugging functions and issues. And we also tried organising the book club. So as I mentioned, a lot of the core code is actually in C, and that's not so widely known among the R community. Well, maybe even in general, not so many people work in pure C, might know C++, it's different. So we wanted to organise this book club over, I think it was 16 weeks. So I think our original plan was to try and get through the first 14 chapters, I think was our goal of this book, Modern C. This book is sort of arranged in sorts of levels, so there's sort of familiar, I can't remember the names, but a sort of familiarity level, an understanding level or something. So this was sort of a sort of crash course in C programming. It turned to be a little bit ambitious. We did run out of steam a bit at the end, and partly just because of the time commitment. We sort of estimated a certain time commitment, and people could only really just sort of read the material in that time. There wasn't really enough time to sort of do exercises and stuff beyond that, given that people are doing this around their ordinary jobs. But it still was useful in the sense that people were, at least some people were able to work on some C code during the sprint when they were new to C. so they must have learned something during this time. So, but I think, it maybe wasn't the best material for the time we had. And another thing we worked on, again through a Google Summer of Code project, was to explore using a GitHub code space. And we were actually able to set up a working code space in time for the sprint. So if you're not familiar with GitHub code spaces, they're really great to let you set up a Linux container with whatever prerequisites you want, and people can just launch the container by clicking a button on GitHub, and it sort of launches it with VS Code ready to go. So this sort of gets around the whole issue of the pain of building from source. If you're either not familiar with sort of building software from source, or you just have, it is just more difficult with R, at least, to build it on Windows or Mac, so you don't have to worry about that because you've got a Linux container and the prerequisites are already there. And we included documentation that sort of went through the workflow of getting the code from Subversion, making a change to the source code, rebuilding R, and seeing the change, so you can go through that whole loop from scratch in an hour and sort of see the whole development workflow. And then we got to the sprints. Let me just see what we did. Not too bad. So here's most of them. We didn't manage to get a picture of everybody that wanted to be photographed because there was a bit of coming and going. But anyway, this is quite a lot of the group, and most people came in person. There were a few people online, some of which with plans, because for one reason or another they knew it would be difficult to come in person. Some, unfortunately, was last minute because of air traffic control issues that we were hit by just before the sprints. So we did have people participating online as well. There was some advantage in that, actually. So one of the people pictured there is Paul Morrell, who's in Auckland. So with this group, he managed to get up quite a good system of them doing some work and then him reviewing it and feeding back. So the 24/7 work. So it can be an advantage. So what were we working on? So we had some goals for translation in advance of the sprint. We knew some of the languages, that people were coming in with. So some, I've already mentioned Brazilian, Portuguese, and Spanish. Some languages are ones that are sort of new. They're not currently there aren't currently translators in R, and those are Arabic and Hindi. And Japanese, it's got quite good coverage in R, but you know, there's got some there, and there's still some improvement that could be made. But as well as actually translating, we also wanted to again improve the documentation. As I mentioned, the Google's Season of Docs project didn't cover the web lates and using that. And still more improvements to the instance, the web late instance itself, to make it more visible. So here's a sort of summary of how we got on in terms of translation. So there were about 2,000 new or updated messages across 14 languages in the end. So you can see, you know, the big ones and most of the ones I mentioned in advance. There's also Hungarian there. That's partly because there was a sort of old set of translations that were able to be imported. So that suddenly we sort of went from 0 to 10% translated. So the best state to be in is approved. So that means the translation isn't going to be edited anymore. Somebody's reviewed it and said it's good. New or updated translation will still be used, but that's just one person's put that forward. And then you sort of get a couple of fuzzy states where there is a translation and it's been marked for edit, or somebody's made a suggestion, which means it won't be used until somebody else has accepted that suggestion. And at least one case, we did sort of go backwards and have a translation deleted, or maybe it was a good thing because the translation was wrong, but that was a very small case. So quite a lot of activity, as you can see there. To put that in context, it's about, so it used to be about 6,000 messages in base R and the full packages language. But in many cases, particularly Japanese and Chinese, you know, a large proportion of that would already be translated. Improving the documentation. So there's a new section in the R Dev Guide about using web late, but also guidelines for translators, with specific guidelines for languages about dealing with issues that are sort of language specific, and improved use of glossaries to agree on, you know, particular terms for particular words. So now we've got a much better place for people to go who are new to translation. And then these are some of the improvements to the instance itself. So the idea of approving translations was something that was only just enabled at the sprint. So that was a new feature that we were using. And then there's a couple of nice things like translation memory. So if you've translated a string before and the same string is used somewhere else in the code space, you can see the previous translation. And with the hyperlinks, you can jump straight to where the English string appears in the source, so you can understand the context. Sometimes you need that in order to make a sensible translation. And then we added some new components that weren't there before. So in addition to the base packages, there's also a set of recommended R packages. Often that are included in the binaries, I think. So there are sort of one step between the base packages and the whole ecosystem of Crown packages. And I already mentioned the Hungarian. And then on the coding side, this was a little bit more fluid. And so we thought it'd be interesting to sort of explain how we went about this. So we did quite a bit of work, again, in the run up to the sprints. We asked people, either participants or members of our core, to propose projects for people to work on. And these were quite a range of things. It could be extending the functionality of a particular function, or improving the behavior, or refactoring something so that it runs faster or better in some way, or working on a focus set. So rather than just trying to pick out individual bugs from the hundreds of bugs on the bug tracker, you know, perhaps a group would look at bugs related to nonlinear mixed effects models or something like that. We also discussed more tentative ideas using GitHub discussions, and these were often wish list items, and these could be for people who weren't even attending the sprint, but wanted to suggest something we might work on. So all the proposed projects were automatically added to GitHub discussions, so they could be discussed more. And then we sort of took the sort of promising discussions and added them as issues on the sprint GitHub repo. And then we continued adding issues as we sort of got closer to the sprint. So there were some ideas that our core came up with sort of quite close to the sprint, things that they were interested to work on, and some other issues even during the sprint, that came out of discussion, so that we could be sort of quite flexible about that and sort of see what rose to the top. And so this is a flavour of what we ended up working on. So one participant that came to a sprint is a blind user of R, and so he was able to have some good discussions about what it was like to use R with a screen reader, and suggest some things that would be useful to be able to do. For example, in the base graphics in R, if you create a plot, there's no sort of object that's returned back to the user. It's just sort of painted onto the screen, which isn't very useful if you're not using R in a visual way. So he wanted some way, to get some information back. Has anything actually been plotted, for example? Is it, and some information that could be interrogated. There was a group that were working, quite a large group that were working on documentation, triaging all the documentation bugs, and then working on the ones that look like there's some consensus about the way forward. Some issues related to packages. Again, we had one of the maintainers of the Crown repository, Ligus, one of the core team, was joining us online, and he was working with people on issues related to packages, for example, improving the messages that Crown sends out to package maintainers, so that it's easier for them to understand what they need to do to fix their package to get it back on Crown. Well, it wasn't actually a huge area, but there were some things related, that were very statistical. For example, enhancing the sample.int function to work better for unequal probability sampling. So it will do something at the moment, but there are more recent algorithms that are better from a statistical point of view. So this idea of adding support from RGB colours was an issue that came up, actually suggested through Fosterdon just before the sprint, and that got took up by an R core member and worked on as a project at the sprint. And then low level was kind of a big bucket for things that didn't fit in everything else. So it could be low level in the sense of working on the C code rather than the R code, or it could be more sort of utility functions and something else. For example, optimizing the random number generation. And so here's how we got on. So in some cases, the work that was done at the sprint was to have a discussion, and then that might get sort of taken back to our core a bit more around and just make a decision on what would be done. In some cases, these discussions would turn into some sort of roadmap, again, possibly for work beyond the sprint, or in a simple case, perhaps an agreement on how to fix a bug. And then that would turn to work in progress, which might be actively working on the code, or possibly running some more tests to inform the iterative process. And then at some point, a patch is proposed, and perhaps accepted and closed. Or so most of these would be closed fixed. There might be one odd one where it was closed but won't fix because it didn't need fixing. So there were sort of 8 things that were closed by the end of the sprint, and at least another 8 since. I'm still sort of chasing up to see where we are at the moment. So in terms of numbers, it might not seem so much different from something like the Bug BBQ, but qualitatively it is quite different because we were picking, there was a much bigger range in terms of the difficulty of things that we were working on and trying to get the simplest things at the Bug BBQ, whereas here it was sort of anything that a contributor could usefully contribute to. There's still a sort of a subset that really want to work on themselves, but these are generally more sort of ambitious projects. So what next? So as far as the working group goes, we sort of plan to continue working in this way, really, providing regular support on the Slack and through the office hours. In terms of events, try and tie in with our conferences where we can. So there's already been Latin R, 2023 has already occurred, and they had a lightning talk about contributing translations, and then a space where people could contribute translations. So that continues the work on the Brazilian, Portuguese and Spanish. And then we're looking ahead to use our 2024, which will be in person. So hopefully we can organise some events around that, and possibly other conferences like PositConf. And even if we can't organise an event, perhaps we can give a talk or other ways to engage other people in the work. Since this is an RSE seminar, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the involvement of RSEs in this. So the newest R core member is actually working as an RSE. There were 3 more people that gave their title as RSE, so not including myself and Ella, but 3 other people at the sprint. Sebastian was also at the sprint. So there's definitely skills that RSEs can bring to this. It makes sense, that people have the software skills and often will have, relevant background in statistics or other areas that they can bring. And so interesting to think whether there's sort of scope for RSEs to get more involved, either in R, which I'm obviously interested in, but there are many other open source projects that perhaps don't have that sort of dedicated time that a sort of focused applied software project will have. Other projects like Python, for example, relying a lot on voluntary contribution. Maybe if we have some time for CPD or service time as part of our roles, then perhaps we can think about using some of that to contribute back to these sort of larger fundamental projects. Or possibly organising local events. So this is something we're thinking about at Warwick. So we probably can't organise a big international sprint too often, but we could gather Warwick or UK folk perhaps at Warwick from time to time to work on contribution, and sometimes you just need a focused event to get people doing things. And if you'd like to get involved yourself, we have all these links and sort of getting a bit tight on time, so I won't talk you all through them. But I'm happy to share my slides. And the main link for finding things is contributor.r-project.org. But I think I've got that on my phone.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's really interesting. Probably quite a lot of things that I guess other languages or projects could actually learn from what you've been doing. Are there any questions here or online at all? Mariam, you got first.
But I would be interested on the first or one of the first slides, this core developer overview, whether you actually have the feeling that the community that will in future change, because it's still an overview went to this year, I think. So have you got any questions?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So what we're doing, I think, is introducing a lot of new people to contribution, but it's still, quite a journey to get to the position where you're added to our core. So it doesn't necessarily solve the issue there, and that is still a big challenge to add anybody to our core, because it's obviously a big commitment, and you sort of have to build the trust with the existing core team first. So it's not something you can easily you can rush it. So yeah. So at the moment, I don't think it will change too much in the short term, but hopefully, we have to keep rolling up things. Hopefully, as we sort of get more people interested in contribution and starting to, and I think part of what we're trying to do is really just sort of say, the door is open, whereas before it might not have seemed like it was. So I think, it's still a first step.
I was just curious. So you've obviously organised lots of different events and been involved in this. Like, so what are the kind of what's the background of the people that come to that want to start, newbies that want to start contributing to like where have they come from? Like why what made them go to your events, or what made them?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I should probably try and so on that. So just I mean, it is quite a spread. So in terms of the people that came to the sprints, it was academics, it was people in the industry. So on the industrial side, they would often be working as software engineers or data scientists. So they are users, and so they have that incentive.
So it's just users that want to just get more involved, is it?
So it tends to be people that are already quite invested in the R community in some way. They might have been involved in, been quite active by going through user groups and conferences, so they feel quite committed to the
ecosystem. Yeah.
And some people, it is sort of their job. So we had people certainly from R Open Sci, if you're familiar with that, a group that sort of collate packages for use in science, and they have some paid positions. There's also we did also have some people coming from Posit, Art Studio, Shiny, and things like that. But others, as I say, are working in various academic roles, not necessarily RSEs, or they're working as data sciences in pharma or whatever, and they're just enjoy programming.
There's one question online, if they're quick. Daniel.
Yeah, hey Heather, this is Daniel here dialing in from Basel, from Roche here. First of all, thanks a lot for these great efforts. I mean, I have really not been aware that there's so much going on, also with the contributing working group and so on. So this is really awesome, and I think this will really provide like a huge improvement of the core team sustainability over time and so on. I think and bringing much more community. So that's great. So just please keep doing what you're doing, and hope we can connect and maybe next year in Salzburg at USR and so on. But very quick question. Do your efforts also, did you also look at CRAN, submissions? There was some comment that you improved the messages coming back from CRAN, but I always feel very bad for the CRAN team because there's only a few people. And recently, for example, I sent them some emails and asked them when do they finish review, and then they were obviously a little bit annoyed at some point and saying, yeah, well, we have day jobs and stuff. So do we have any idea how we can help the CRAN team more and scale up the kind of effort they have, because now they have 20,000 packages and counting more, right?
There is actually a separate working group that's trying to do that, that's trying to find ways to support CRAN, and has had some conversations with CRAN about what they can do. So I think it's called the R Repositories Working Group, and I'm not sure how easy it will be to Google and find them. So I'm happy for to connect with you and make sure you have the link and add it to my slides or something, so other people can find it afterwards. So I think it's been Joe Rickett from the R Consortium that's been sort of organising that. So
Right.
might be able to find it that way, but
Okay.
yeah. So there is some initiative there, but it has been hard going, you know, because as you say, the existing members are busy, so it's always this difficult situation where they're sort of too busy to bring other people in, but they need other people to come in, you know. So, but people are trying.